In this video, we're going to talk about the real reason that Games Workshop end-timed Warhammer Fantasy Battles, as in they got rid of it and replaced it with Age of Sigmar. Now the information for this video comes from the Painting Phase YouTube channel. In it, Peachy and a guy called Jeff, I don't really know who Jeff is, many apologies, but Peachy did work for Games Workshop. In it they talk about Warhammer Fantasy and why it was effectively destroyed. So one reason that is often bandied about, and it's sort of nice to have a little bit of confirmation, is that they couldn't necessarily, it's either copyrightable, trademark it, whatever the phrase is, they were struggling to copyright it, to make it so that they had that intellectual property and nobody else could use it. You know, an orc is just an orc. Any company could make orcs and sell them as orcs, and Games Workshop couldn't do anything about that, especially considering that the IP was sort of generic and Tolkien inspired in the first place. And as soon as you see what they did with Age of Sigmar, that makes complete sense, right? We have Oryx, Ideneth Deepkin, Stormcast Eternals, all these sort of like phrases that are very unique. They're not from anything. They maybe are inspired by something, but they definitely have their own twist to that thing. And for some reason, this got on Games Workshop nerves. Now, the funny thing about this is, with the dawn of 3D printing, you could pretty much, if you want right now, find a Space Marine and print it. There's so many models available now, you could probably find miniatures for Ideneth, Deepkin, Oryx, just called orcs, but that look like Iron Jaws or whatever the hell they are. You can find models that pretty much are almost like for like when it comes to Games Workshop stuff. So the whole reason for that being a thing is probably not even that important anymore because of 3D printing. One thing they sort of mentioned briefly is that because of that, you could just sort of use generic models. You didn't necessarily have to use Games Workshop. You could just go and buy some archers. You know, Bretonnian knights are just knights, medieval knights at the end of the day. Bretonnian archers are basically just normal human archers from historical miniatures. You could just go buy miniatures and they were more often than not cheaper. Now, another reason that they talk about, and I don't necessarily understand this one or fully agree with it, but I'm not necessarily a lore buffy nerd kind of guy, apologies if you are, but they said that you couldn't really expand the universe or the world very much, and I don't really agree with that one. Yes, a lot of the stuff was like regimented, and the example that they give is that I think they wanted to give the dwarfs like a tank, but they didn't really fit in the world, and I'm just not really sure that that wouldn't be a massive problem. Yes, maybe giving dwarfs a tank would be an issue, but they also spoke about like new races and stuff like that, because they said, hey, where would they have been? Which, alright, fair enough, that will be a question. But Games Workshop, they had the power to control the law. They could have written an island somewhere in the middle of nowhere and had a new army or faction just be there. If they wanted another human race somewhere else, they could have been isolated humans from long ago that have created their own culture. Like, if you're in power of the IP yourself, you can do what you like. Retcon it whatever way you want. They could have made steam tanks for dwarfs, even though I think it would have been a bit weird with the Empire and a steam tank. They could have made tanks for dwarfs. But I think at some point, the players probably wouldn't have wanted that. A lot of players were probably playing it because of its sort of more realistic medieval fantasy vibe, rather than just going, you know, full Age of Sigmar craziness kind of thing. Age of Sigmar isn't actually that crazy, but you get the gist. So those are 3 reasons, but there's actually a bigger reason they talk about, and it's only slightly hinted at, but the main point is it just wasn't very popular. At one point they talk about, well, we released something and it wasn't sold very much, but people really wanted more of it, and it's like, well, how can we give you more if nobody's buying it? And that is a very fair statement. They actually said that Games Workshop basically put it as the 3rd main game. It wasn't even second. So initially it was 40k, obviously 40k is right at the very top. Then it was Warhammer Fantasy, but when they actually got the Lord of the Rings license, that became the 2nd game. In fact, I think Peach even says that it almost approached 40k levels of popularity at one point, and even after the films had gone away, it was still more popular than Warhammer Fantasy. Now that's crazy to me, because at the time I would have sworn that Warhammer Fantasy was more popular. However, I think that strongly shows how popular an IP can actually sell models. There was probably a lot of people just buying those models and not actually playing. Well, it turns out there was a lot of people not actually playing or buying Warhammer Fantasy. It was the 3rd main game. And Peachy says when they got rid of Warhammer Fantasy, sales of Age of Sigmar very, very quickly caught up and overtook what it used to be. Warhammer Fantasy was very quickly dwarfed by Warhammer Age of Sigmar. And it's interesting now because what will have changed? Well, he sort of alludes to it. He actually, I don't know if this was intentional or not, but Peachy talks about that when he's playing Warhammer Fantasy, sometimes he said it felt like playing Total War because you had to move blocks and stuff like that, which is funny because a lot of people believe that Total War Warhammer is actually one of the reasons that Warhammer Fantasy is coming back. So that overlapping connectivity there might actually make a lot of sense. Peachy also talks about how he thinks that the end times was rushed. Now, I don't necessarily agree with him here either, if I'm honest. Yes, it probably was rushed, but I don't necessarily think it would have been better to stretch it out. Whilst to some extent the shock was perhaps like reverberating and quite strong and a lot of players felt like strong resentment, I'm not sure dragging it out would have made it much better. If anything, I think that possibly could have hurt Age of Sigmar. Once you've made that decision, it's going to be difficult. Peachy says that the reason is that he wanted people to actually like play the games and they never really got the chance before another book came out and stuff like that, which is probably true. I'm just not convinced that basically being slower would have been in any way, shape or form better. A bit of me thinks just get the band-aid, rip it off as quickly as possible and move on. So yeah, those were the 4 like main reasons. You couldn't like copyright it, so if somebody made orcs like Mantic, they could just come along, make like for like miniatures. Games Workshop couldn't do anything about it. So with Age of Sigmar, obviously they're a bit more like unique and specialized. You could just get replaceable miniatures either from Mantic or even like historical games, and they were cheaper. They felt a little bit constrained by the law, which as I said, I'm not really sure I agree with that one because I feel like they could have just expanded past it, but maybe that would have like annoyed the player base at the time. Who knows? And then the main one, which really is the death blow for any game, it just wasn't that popular, which is really interesting considering it's coming back as sort of like a side game. We'll have to wait and see how popular it actually is when it returns. The return of Warhammer The Old World. So I'll leave a link to the video with Peachy and Jeff on the painting phase. It's normally like a hobby channel, but they do obviously these kind of like podcasts. It's like an hour long, but it's only really like the first half where they talk about the old world and stuff like that. So even if you're not interested in 40k, I do strongly recommend you go and check it out. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I hope you have a most beautiful day. Like and subscribe. Goodbye.